I can say that I did not really choose public service. Rather, I more or less fell into it early on, perhaps not fully appreciating the challenges from such service.
Robert Mueller, who finds himself thrust into the political spotlight, began his path of service decades earlier. Robert Swan Mueller III is born August 7, 1944 in New York City. Raised in Philadelphia, Mueller spends his formative years at the prestigious all-boys prep school, St. Paul's, in Concord, New Hampshire.
He was a fun guy. It was not somebody that would dominate conversation among students, among the guys, but he was attentive, engaged, fun to be around.
He was exceptionally accomplished as a student and as an athlete, but he was completely unpretentious, even self-effacing, quiet, and just very authentic as a person.
At St. Paul's, an emphasis is placed on athletics, and Mueller joins the lacrosse, soccer, and hockey teams.
He was a great leader. You could tell from playing with him that winning the right way was important to him.
At a school full of the bright and ambitious, Mueller stands out. But he is not the only future DC fixture in his class.
One of Bob Mueller's classmates was John Kerry, who obviously had a distinguished career in his own right.
John was more of an openly ambitious young man.
John Kerry was, in some ways, a more forceful or more visible character in the school, but Bob Mueller got a sort of outsized level of respect for how quiet and unpretentious he was.
After graduation, Mueller enrolls at his father's alma mater, Princeton. As he had at St. Paul's, he's on the lacrosse team and becomes friends with an upperclassman named David Hackett. It's a relationship that will shape the rest of his life.
He was not necessarily the best on the team, but he was a determined and a natural leader. David graduated that spring and was far from our thoughts as we went on to our senior year.
In 1965, Hackett graduates and volunteers to fight in the still burgeoning conflict in Vietnam. After volunteering for a second tour, he's killed in the spring of 1967 by a sniper's bullet.
One would have naturally thought that the life of a Marine and David's death in Vietnam would argue strongly against following in his footsteps. But many of us saw in him the person we wanted to be, even before his untimely death. And a number of his friends and teammates joined the Marine Corps because of him, as did I.
While many of his peers avoid serving, Bob Mueller decides to enlist.
It is well known that it was in some ways a poor person's war, and the idea of a St. Paul's and Princeton person being in that mix, they were pretty rare.
I remember hearing that Bob had volunteered to go to Vietnam. I didn't know why, but I thought it seemed very much in keeping with his character.
Mueller ships out to Vietnam and assumes command of an infantry platoon. On December 11, 1968, just weeks after his deployment, his men come under heavy fire. He is awarded a Bronze Star for combat valor.
His Bronze Star citation in part read, Second Lieutenant Mueller moved fearlessly with complete disregard for his own safety.
4 months later, in April of 1969, Mueller's platoon is attacked by the Viet Cong. During the ferocious firefight, he is shot through the thigh by an enemy AK-47. Despite his injury, Mueller refuses to withdraw until his men are out of harm's way. The incident earns him a Purple Heart.
I always did consider myself fortunate to have lived through the war in Vietnam, and there were many men such as David Hackett who did not. And in some sense, you feel that you have been given a second lease on life, and you want to make the most of it to contribute in some way.
Coming up.
We were having enormous spikes in the murder rate in the District of Columbia, and it was a very, very serious problem.
Now here's this guy who is
making so much money, yet he wanted to be a low-level homicide prosecutor.
From undergrad at Princeton to under fire in Vietnam, Robert Mueller returns to the U.S., determined to continue in service to his country.
The way in which you choose to serve does not matter, only that you work to better the country and your community.
The former Marine enrolls at the University of Virginia Law School, intent on becoming an FBI agent, but is soon working as a prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Francisco.
He's very serious, very professional, very dedicated, but he had a good sense of humor. He was just one of the best. He was one of the top-ranked 2 or 3 prosecutors in our office.
The old guard in the defense bar knew Bob as a highly competent courtroom lawyer and somebody who should be feared in trial. He was quietly effective and was a fierce opponent.
A few years later, Mueller leaves San Francisco for a job in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston.
8 years later, I'm in private practice here in Delaware, and one of my clients gets indicted in Springfield, Massachusetts. All of a sudden, I learned that Bob was going to be the prosecutor. I was walking into court early, maybe 8 o'clock in the morning, and there's Bob in his shirt sleeves with piles of papers that he had just Xeroxed. The guy is the acting United States Attorney in Boston. He's the head of the office. He could have had anybody doing that, and he did that.
In 1989, Mueller joins the Justice Department, eventually becoming head of the criminal division. There, he oversees a number of high-profile cases, including the investigation of the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 and the prosecutions of Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega and mob boss John Gotti.
It can seem daunting at first to take on such a big case as Pan Am or Gotti, but Mueller's very disciplined. And I think for him, you don't look at the thing as a whole and say, oh, that's just too big. You start to say, all right, how do we attack this?
In 1993, to the surprise of many, Mueller leaves the public sector and takes a job as a white-collar litigator at a law firm, Hale & Dorr.
I was having dinner with Bob Mueller in Boston, and he was talking about how unhappy he was in private practice. He had to keep track of his hours. He was representing corporations in civil cases. It just wasn't his thing.
So Bob Mueller did something quite remarkable. He called up the U.S. Attorney in Washington and said, I want to prosecute murder cases.
The U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C. at the time, future Attorney General Eric Holder, remembers taking the call.
I remind him that he already had a great job, that there was no way I'd be able to match his current salary, and that having already served as Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, he might be a little overqualified for a job as a line prosecutor. But before he could change his mind, I just said, when can you start?
That is who he is. I think at his core, that's the work that he loves the most.
And this was when we were having enormous spikes in the murder rate in the District of Columbia, and it was a very, very serious problem. People were trying to find a way out of what was a very dangerous and desperate situation. And there was a need for people who had the skills and ability and the dedication to the rule of law, like Bob Mueller, to come in and take that role.
We can almost picture Mueller as being in sort of a 90s cop show. He would answer the phone and say, Mueller, homicide. Sounds like he had never been happier.
Mueller's hard work in D.C. doesn't go unnoticed. In 1997, he's offered a job back in San Francisco as the U.S. Attorney of Northern California. The former Marine brings with him a more disciplined style of management.
He beat everybody to the office every morning. Before he left, he would walk the halls and see who was in their offices. And he took note of who was still there working at 6 o'clock and who had gone home.
People might complain about, oh, Bob is really working as hard. But they kind of were proud of themselves because they were working hard. He brings that out in people.
Mueller beefs up the department's white-collar crime division and starts a new unit to tackle cybercrime, one of the first of its kind in the country.
He's a sort of computer geek. He really is. He loves computers. He loved them when they first came out. He loved to see what they could do. He plays with them. He goes upstairs, and he does it with great seriousness.
He created the first CHIP, or Computer Hacking Intellectual Property Unit. Now every U.S. Attorney's Office has something modeled that's called a CHIP network.
People like me who were opponents the entire time Bob was here. Ended up seeing a renewed life in the office that was refreshing. It's like playing tennis. Your game is always better when the person on the other side of the net is at the top of their game.
Credited with turning around the Northern California office, Mueller's profile is on the rise. And he's about to be tapped for his biggest assignment yet.
Our next FBI director has given nearly all his career to public service, going back to his days in the Marine Corps.
President George W. Bush nominates Robert Mueller, a Republican, to be the 6th director of the FBI on July 5, 2001.
Protect and defend the Constitution.
After a bruising election victory over Al Gore, partisan rancor in D.C. is at an all-time high. Bush's pick to run the FBI needs Democratic backing to ensure confirmation.
I think he was seen as somebody, a serious, well-regarded, disciplined, highly focused, and very much a team player.
Willie Brown, San Francisco's mayor during Mueller's tenure as U.S. attorney, lobbies California's Democratic senators on his behalf.
He came in to see me because he needed to get Democratic senatorial approval for the job which he was being offered as head of the FBI. And I was pleased that he did, because I loved speaking to Senator Feinstein and Senator Boxer about my experience with him, my knowledge of him, and the reputation that I knew that he had.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
The camera-shy Mueller speaks for a grand total of 47 seconds at his own nomination ceremony.
Again, thank you, Mr. President, for the confidence you've shown in me. Thank you, sir. Congratulations. Thank you.
3 weeks later, at his confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, Mueller is more forthcoming.
Waco, Ruby Ridge, the FBI lab, Wen Ho Lee, Robert Hansen, and the McVeigh documents. These familiar names and events remind us all that the FBI is far from perfect, and that the next director faces significant management and administrative challenges.
There were a number of high-profile incidents that raised concern during the last director's term. So when Bob Mueller came on board, part of it was to instill confidence back in the FBI.
And all of these were sort of piling up as Mueller faced the prospect of taking over the FBI.
We must and we will confront these challenges squarely and forthrightly.
Now, we understand that the FBI is now requiring polygraphs for managers handling national security matters. Are you willing to continue that approach?
Yes.
And would you be willing to take polygraph yourself if that were the case?
Yes, indeed. It is my belief you don't. This may be my training from the Marine Corps, but you don't ask people to do that which you're unwilling to do yourself. I have already taken that polygraph.
The only reason I asked that question is I knew you had, and I just think it's important. Yeah, how did you do?
I'm sitting here. That's all I can
I'm
say.
sorry.
In an increasingly partisan Congress, Mueller is confirmed with 98 yeas and 0 nays in the U.S. Senate. His first day of work is set for September 4th, 2001.
I'd been director for 1 week, and as I recall it, I was in my office, and an individual came in and said there's a plane that's crashed into the World Trade Center in New York, and I look outside and it's a beautiful day, and you wonder how a pilot could be so off flight path to fly into the World Trade Center. And I think we were all wondering about that, and then word came of the second plane going into the World Trade Center.
A third jetliner flies into the Pentagon. A fourth, destined for Washington, D.C., crashes in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Can you imagine? 7 days into the job, he's hit with 9/11. I mean, he's just beginning to learn his way around FBI headquarters when suddenly he faces the biggest domestic act of terrorism in American history, and he has to figure out how to respond to that.
Frank Figluzzi served as assistant director for counterintelligence in Mueller's FBI.
We kind of felt sorry for the guy. He's just starting to learn how the bureaucracy works, and instead a crisis intervenes that is baptism by fire. and he's got to learn who to trust around him quickly.
And on September 12, 2001, he showed up in our Strategic Operations Center to take command of probably the worst time ever to become a director in the history of the FBI.
Our first effort is to identify any associates in the United States who might be related to the hijackers.
I remember being incredibly comfortable for the country because he was in that position. I think anybody that knew him felt that way and felt like it, you know, if there's anybody that's capable of dealing with this situation, it's Bob. He'll be able to do it.
George W. Bush at the time is demanding briefings 2 or 3 times a day on the phone, in person. And this is someone who, because of his rigor and discipline, was able to rise to the occasion.
3 days after the attacks unfold, Mueller is summoned to a meeting at the White House with President Bush.
He was very focused, given his background as prosecutor and investigator, on here's what we've done to figure out who's responsible for these devastating attacks on September 11th.
And I get 2 or 3 minutes into it, and I recall President Bush saying, well, Bob, that's all well and good. We expect the Bureau to identify and bring to justice those responsible. But my question to you today is, what is the FBI doing to prevent the next terrorist attack?
That changed Bob Mueller's life. It changed the trajectory and the transformation of the FBI from that minute forward.
Coming up.
The FBI wasn't just behind the rest of the government in technology, it was behind the country in technology.
It was just a nightmare, and he couldn't believe it.
In the wake of the attacks of September 11th, Robert Mueller's mission is clear. He must shift the FBI's focus to the new global war on terrorism.
The FBI's mission really changed after 9/11. International affairs were left to the CIA. They were seen as the leaders of that international intelligence community. That wasn't what we pictured the FBI doing pre-9/11. Robert Mueller was steering the ship that slowly changed in that direction.
We had to prioritize, make counterterrorism our number 1 priority, and make certain that we expended whatever resources were necessary to prevent the next terrorist attack, not just to determine who was responsible for September 11th.
He led that charge, and it was like turning the Titanic. So in order to do that, he imposed very rigorous discipline on all of us. So he'd come in extremely early, functioned on very little sleep, and expected us to do the same.
Good evening. The FBI makes more arrests today to hold people for further questioning.
But as the U.S. becomes embroiled in the war on terror, Mueller, a staunch supporter of the Constitution, is uncomfortable with the possible erosion of civil rights.
I knew and understand that we would be judged not only on how successful we were in preventing attacks, but how successful we were in doing that within the confines and constraints of the Constitution.
I brought the case to get due process, or right to hearing, for the people at Guantanamo. I got a lot of flack for it. We had a Christmas dinner party right after the case in 2002. And in the middle of it, Bob Mueller stood up and gave me a toasted me, saying that I'm doing exactly what an American lawyer should be doing. That doesn't denigrate. He wanted to get the bad guys, but he recognized the importance of sticking to our principles and doing it so that we don't bring shame on our nation.
In a rare interview, Mueller explains.
It's important that the American public trust the FBI. I get the sense that that means a great deal to you.
The most important thing for the Bureau is its integrity.
In revamping the Bureau's mission after 9/11, Mueller discovers that his agency is woefully ill-equipped technologically to deal with the threat of terrorism.
The FBI wasn't just behind the rest of the government in technology, it was behind the country in technology.
When I first came into the FBI, there was no email. There was a machine called a Vidget machine, where you actually would take a photograph and you would watch it like an amazed little kid. One line at a time, it would actually go through and you'd see the Boston office picking that photo up. It would take about 4 hours.
The computers were not connected to the internet. Most communications were done by fax. When 9/11 occurred, there were dozens of fax machines lined up in the command center, and all these faxes were coming in. Nobody could keep track of them. It was just a nightmare, and he couldn't believe it.
As he had done in California, building the cybercrime unit, Mueller makes modernizing the Bureau a top priority.
And he really brought it into the 21st century and into a period of time where the national security landscape had completely changed.
And Mueller's buttoned-up management style contrasts sharply with that of his predecessor, Louis Freeh.
Director Freeh was an agent's agent, very laid-back, charismatic style of leadership.
Whereas Mueller didn't try to suck up to the agents at all. Mueller was the boss. He wanted the straight answers.
I think a misconception of Bob Mueller is that he was very, very hard on people and they walked away hurt because he was so probative. But he knew when someone wasn't being 100% accurate. And that left a lot of people frustrated, but it also made everybody around the table, when you came in to brief Bob Mueller, you better be prepared.
So you would not get by with mere vagueness or we're all over it, Bob, or we've got it handled, Mr. Director. If you didn't have a command of those facts, he would make it known to an aide or assistant that he simply didn't need to be briefed by you again. And indeed, you would not see the inside of the director's conference room again.
Mueller, a husband and father of two, famously puts in long hours at the office.
He led by example. If he got to the office at 5:30 in the morning, you wanted to get to the office at 5:30 in the morning. If he stayed till late at night, you wanted to stay until late at night.
He has an ability to not just rule with an iron fist, because that's not particularly effective leadership. He has the ability to just raise everybody's game and make them do better.
I can't remember a written product, no matter how carefully we'd edit it, where he didn't find a change. And that makes you raise up your game.
I think the word enjoy would not be the first one that comes to mind for people who work for Bob Mueller. Respect, admire, yes. But he could be very tough and very demanding, and Mueller, in fact, admits this about himself, that he could be quite impatient.
But I think what most people don't realize is him, because he has this tough exterior, is that he really had a spot in his heart for FBI employees.
Day in and day out, agents put their lives on the line. But if you lose an agent, you can lose it to cancer, you can lose it to in a line of duty. We respond as a family. We have lost a piece of our body, so to speak.
And I think what most people don't know is that even the agents that died in the line of duty, Bob Mueller had pictures of them in his office. You didn't frequently get to go into Bob Mueller's office, but over to the side of his was every single agent that died during his tenure, you know, in the FBI. And he looked at those pictures every single day. I think that's lost on a lot of individuals. They see Bob Mueller as this tough guy, right? But he really felt every single one of those, you know, fallen agents in the FBI.
Coming up,
Bob Mueller can certainly be the person who would bring down this presidency.
He will take a hold of you like a dog with a bone, and he will not give up. And if you did it and he's got decent evidence, you're going to get convicted.
A decade after the 9/11 attacks, the FBI hardly resembles the institution that Robert Mueller had taken over. After 10 years on the job, now serving under his second president, Mueller's term as director is about to expire.
You cannot stay longer than 10 years. It's not something at the discretion of the president. It is a 10-year term, and that's it.
The FBI director's term limit was put in place in the 1970s after the death of original director J. Edgar Hoover, who led the department for nearly 50 years.
Congress's interest was to make sure there are no more J. Edgar Hoovers. No more people who could acquire so much power because they had been in the FBI so long that they were basically uncontrollable and feared.
Finding a replacement proves to be difficult.
We were having trouble finding anybody who came up to his standards. We really were. And so we started thinking about, well, what do we do?
He came into the morning meeting with his 10 most senior executives in the organization and said very kind of casually that the President of the United States has asked me to stay for 2 more years, and I've accepted.
None of the previous directors had finished their 10-year terms, let alone exceeded them. Extending Mueller requires Congress to pass a new law, which clears the Senate unanimously.
The decision to extend Bob Mueller's term, it's the only time it had ever happened. It was a remarkable testament to him that Congress approved this.
Mueller's 2-year extension ends in the summer of 2013. He hands a completely overhauled FBI to a new director, James Comey, a man who would 4 years later play a major role in the initial phase of the Russia investigation.
The FBI was now a full-fledged member of the U.S. intelligence community and not just the premier law enforcement agency in the United States. He earned the respect of the American people with the concept that America is at peace because the FBI is at war.
After leaving the FBI, Mueller is hired as a partner at the law firm Wilmer Hale, but his former life is never far from his mind.
I remember sitting with him one time in his office at Wilmer Hale after he left the FBI and asking him how life was. I definitely got the impression that his life of service was not finished.
While Bob Mueller is working away at Wilmer Hale on behalf of clients like the NFL and Sony, Donald Trump is elected president.
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton.
Casting a shadow over the new administration are concerns about Russian hacking during the campaign. And just weeks after his confirmation as Attorney General, Jeff Sessions recuses himself from any investigation into Russian meddling when his contact with the Russian ambassador during the campaign comes to light.
I have now decided to recuse myself from any existing or future investigations.
3 months later, in a stunning turn,
President Trump has fired James Comey as director of the FBI.
FBI directors aren't really supposed to be fired and hired like cabinet officials. The FBI director is appointed to a 10-year term, which is supposed to overlap at least 2 administrations. This is supposed to insulate the FBI director from politics to ensure that they're not loyal to one party or another.
The initial reasons the administration gave for firing Jim Comey was because they said the Bureau had lost trust in him, that it was because of his work on the Hillary Clinton email investigation that they had lost trust and therefore he needed to be replaced. Shortly after Comey was fired, President Trump went on NBC.
Regardless of recommendation, I was going to fire Comey. This Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse.
The firing of Comey and the questions about Russia's involvement in the 2016 election lead to an uproar in Congress. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein must step in since his boss has recused himself.
Partly for the sake of the image of the Justice Department, the independence of the investigation, as a way to solve the pressure that he was getting from Congress, and to be able to stay as Deputy Attorney General, Rosenstein decided that a special counsel needed to be brought in.
I think Rod was looking for somebody of unimpeachable integrity and a deep and abiding respect for the law, whose judgment really can't be questioned. But when you make that list, Bob Mueller's name has got to be at the top.
Rod Rosenstein today took himself out of overseeing the Russia investigation, turning that over to Robert Mueller.
If you were looking for someone who was going to move into a difficult and politically charged situation and give people a sense that what he said was real and true, it was an inspired pick.
The investigation begins in the spring of 2017. Mueller assembles a team of some of the country's highest profile and seasoned investigators.
One thing about Bob Mueller, he's always been able to surround himself with people that are very, very good. And that's probably one of the skills that he has that have allowed him to succeed in many of the things he's done.
The way to best understand Mueller's investigations is to look at it as buckets. There's a Russia bucket, an obstruction bucket, and a finance bucket. The bucket we know the most about is the obstruction one. These are questions about what the president has done since he came into office. Why did he fire James Comey? Why did he ask for Comey to end the Flynn investigation? Why has he demanded so much loyalty of the folks running the investigation?
With indictments handed up and guilty pleas from multiple Trump associates, the probe shows no signs of winding down.
Has there ever been a new presidency where 4 members of the presidential campaign ended up charged with felonies before the end of the new president's first year in office? Has there ever been a presidency when the national security advisor or somebody at that level flipped to become a cooperating witness?
The possibility of a Russia connection has followed this president since his election, which he repeatedly denies.
There has been no collusion.
There is absolutely no collusion.
The whole Russian thing was an excuse for the Democrats losing the election.
Bob Mueller is the top of the game when it comes to a prosecutor in terms of his judgment, in terms of his doggedness, in terms of his ability, and maybe most importantly, the prosecutors you fear most are the ones who aren't full of bluster, who aren't puffing their chest out, but the ones who are going to quietly and single-mindedly pick your case apart. And that's the kind of focus that Bob brings to this job.
Special counsel Bob Mueller is dialing up the pressure on two former Trump aides, clearly squeezing Paul Manafort tighter and tighter.
In February 2018, Mueller levels 32 new charges against Paul Manafort and his deputy Rick Gates, detailing an alleged scheme of money laundering and tax evasion. Manafort pleads not guilty. But Gates, in a cooperation agreement with Mueller, pleads guilty to felony charges of conspiracy and making false statements, becoming the third Trump aide to strike such a deal. Also under focus, the release by WikiLeaks of Democrats' emails during the 2016 presidential election. Who knew what and when?
Did Trump know that emails were about to come out, that the Russians had these?
Mueller subpoenas the Trump Organization to hand over all documents related to Russia in March of 2018.
We now have this going beyond the campaign, beyond the time in the White House, and to the heart of the Trump Organization.
According to the Washington Post, that same month, when talking to the president's lawyers, special counsel Mueller describes President Trump as a subject of the investigation and not a criminal target.
Subject is the middle status. Subject is more than a witness. Subject is someone whose conduct is being investigated, but at this time is not apparently guilty of a crime.
For the time being, Mueller continues his work.
He will take this wherever it leads. I just wish that we could let him do his job. I keep hearing dueling memos and so forth from the intelligence committees, and my hope is that what the intelligence committee will do is spend its time trying to figure out exactly how the Russians did what they did and how to keep them from doing it again.
Throughout the probe, there has been a growing drumbeat to end the investigation and fire Mueller.
I have concerns with Mr. Mueller as it relates to bias.
We do not know the magnitude of this insider bias on Mr. Mueller's team.
It's time to get it under control. Mueller is not the answer, he's the problem.
The president has been sharing his own views on Twitter for months. The Mueller probe should never have been started in that there was no collusion and there was no crime. And later, a total witch hunt with massive conflicts of interest. But will anyone stand in Mueller's way?
Bob Mueller can't be bullied. He can't be intimidated. I don't think Bob Mueller will ever bow to any political pressure from anybody.
The entire thing has been a witch hunt, and there is no collusion between certainly myself and my campaign, but I can always speak for myself and the Russians, zero.
He understands the responsibility. He knows the country is watching. He wants to get it done right.
Mueller has already indicated that potential White House obstruction is in his criminal investigative purview.
Today, Mueller charged 13 Russian nationals with illegally interfering in the American political process.
But if there's illegality in the way of his investigation, he'll find it and he'll pursue it. Bob Mueller can certainly be the person who would bring down this presidency.
Mr. President, would you still like to testify to Special Counsel Robert Mueller?